Good morning, everyone, here on the East Coast. My name is Sean Colleen, and I'm here to talk a little bit today about the NUnit docs contribution process. I'm doing this as a live stream, mostly just because it's quick and dirty, and I didn't want to do a whole bunch of video editing afterwards. So don't worry if you're tuning in a little bit late. We're just going to go through the NUnit docs contribution process today. Along the way, we're going to showcase GitHub Codespaces. We're going to look at how you might edit an NUnit documentation item, like through VS Code, through the GitHub UI, or through our GitHub Codespaces. And along the way, hopefully I'll show a little bit about how we built these things, talk a little bit about how they all fit together. So at the end, we'll have an understanding of how the NUnit build system works, the kind of steps that we're using, how the GitHub Codespaces is set up, and how you can contribute to the NUnit docs if you'd like to. All right, so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and we will get started. Do a little configuration here. Okay. All right, so we've got our screen here, and here I've got the NUnit docs repository. The NUnit docs repository is at github.com/NUnit/docs. And what we'll look at here is there are some ways that we can edit documentation. Now, the docs site lives at docs.nunit.org. So if we go to the actual site itself, we see there are several links, for example, improve this doc. So we'll start there and we'll talk a little bit about how someone might improve this documentation right from the website. So let's look at, say, the NUnit page here, the NUnit documentation. It's a pretty basic page. I'll click the link on the right to improve this doc. We're using a static site generator called docfx that is produced by Microsoft to generate this site. And so that includes the ability to add this link here. Now, this link we can see takes us to a markdown file in GitHub. So we have a couple options here, right? We could clone the repository, we could check it out, we could then make a code file modification, but GitHub has, of course, a handy edit icon here on the right-hand side. And we can choose to edit this file in place. So what that means here is we'll go to edit in place, and we'll pop up an edit window for the documentation. So I'll suggest a new documentation improvement. I'll say NUnit documentation, this is a test. And we'll click the commit changes button here after making our changes. Now I have the option to commit directly to the master branch, but someone else would not. It'll prompt you to make a fork of the repository, your own copy of things if you don't have it. And then you can go ahead and I'll say I'm adding some test text for the purposes of a demo. I can create a new patch here, so we'll call it, add, we'll create a new branch here, we'll call it add demo text. I'm gonna go ahead and propose those changes. And we'll see here, it's created a branch for me called add demo text, and now it's created a pull request where I can submit these changes. I'd like, so we'll put work in progress so I can't merge it. I'll put that for here, add some new demo text to the site. And we'll just say, I'm doing this demo PR for the purposes of a video tutorial. And so we'll go ahead and create that pull request here. Now, when we create that pull request, we'll see that some things are going on here. One, I've got my pull request created, but we've got some build steps that are happening here. The first is going to be markdown linting. I make sure that our markdown is like an appropriate format, that the headings look right, that we're using the right kind of standard stuff throughout in terms of our formatting to kind of keep things consistent with our markdown. The next is a spell check, which is also we have a dictionary of words that we accept. So if you add a new word, you may also have to add it to this dictionary. And then lastly is the build process, where we make sure we build the site with docfx. So once these things kick off, we see markdown and spell checking have already finished. We can look at and we can go ahead and merge this pull request if we wanted to. Of course, I'll close this one in particular. And along the way here, right, maintainers like myself of the documentation can give you feedback, can add comments, can approve the change, for example. And so once that's done, we can sort of enable that merge. So that's one way of doing the workflow. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this pull request here for demo purposes only. We'll go ahead and close it with that comment. So let's go ahead and look at the docs again. Let's try another route here. If we wanted to do something a little bit more advanced, Go to the same page one more time. We'll click Improve this doc. It'll take us back to that page here. But now we can see we have a couple options here. I can open this with github.dev, which opens a VS Code window in the browser, or I can go to GitHub Desktop and clone it locally. But we actually have another option as well. One of the things we can do before we talk about doing it locally is, say you don't want to download everything, right? This is a documentation site. You don't want to download you don't want to download, or you don't want to clone the repository. You don't want to go through all that hassle. That's fine. We actually have the options of using GitHub Codespaces with the NUnit docs, and this is something that we've put in some work, and I'm pretty proud of what we've been able to do here. I'll actually delete this old code space, and we'll create a new one from scratch here just to show you what happens. So if we go to Code, and pull up the Codespaces menu, I can see create a new code space. Let's go ahead and do that. Click that and we'll see what's happening here. See, GitHub is setting up our code space and it's building a container. Now, this is a container that we have in our repository. It is a Docker file, and we'll show you how that works in a little bit. It uses the same container that we use to build the DocFX stuff, so you have a nice consistent experience there, and it adds some additional tooling to that. So you see here, it's building that container, then it's going to run the steps that are in our Docker file to install Node, which we use for some of our tooling, etc. And then what you're going to see at the end is this is going to open a brand new code space. It'll open our code in VS Code in a browser window. And one of the nice things is it's already going to have the recommended extensions installed for VS Code. So you'll get nice syntax highlighting and things like that. It'll already have some one-line commands that we have for use on how to, so if you don't have to remember all of the docfx commands, you can just type build, for example. You don't have to remember how we do spell checking. You can just type spell check. So we did this to try to give a better on-ramp for folks who are looking to contribute to these things. So hopefully this will be done in a second here. I do have to work on the amount of startup time that it takes, but we'll be okay with that momentarily. All right. So now we see here in the browser, which still blows my mind a little bit. In the browser, we have a Visual Studio Code window. And okay, things should be loaded here. So for example, if I wanted to spell check or spell check the docs here, I could just type spell check. We should see that process is running now. And at the end, you'll see it, checked 300 files or something like that, and shouldn't find any spelling errors because I'm on the main branch and we don't let anything in if there are spelling errors. All right. Oh, okay, we'd like to relaunch the terminal. We can do that. That's fine. And the spell check command again. Now, while we're waiting for that command to finish, I just want to point out here that we do have all of the files that we might need to do anything with, right? We have all the entire files for the docs repository, all of our articles, everything's in here. We also have the ability to create new branches, right, and create pull requests right from this. And in fact, we'll demonstrate that here, where I will go ahead and create a new branch here. I'll call it another demo. I'm in the another demo branch. We can see, oh, sorry, my face is, yeah, let me switch up the screen here. All right, so down here, we'll see there's a branch called another demo that is happening here. And so we see our spell check is finished here in the terminal. And so now that we're on that new branch, I can even do something along the lines of, I can hit the F1 key there just to pull up the command palettes, similar to how you might pull up the command palette in VS Code. And I can type, for example, pull request, create pull request. Right? We haven't made any changes yet, though, so let's do that first. So let's take our NUnit article here. which I think was here. So the same article we were doing, right? We can say again, this is a test, right? I'm doing it in the browser here. And so that's going to automatically save that file for me, which is kind of nice, kind of an auto save as you go. I see some changes. So I'll say, add some intro text, right? And then I can even go into here and hit F1 and say new, create a pull request. So it'll say, okay, from here, I can create a pull request, and I'll say demo, add some intro text, and I'll say another demo of using Codespaces to make changes to the NUnit docs. All right, and we'll say right now, we'll go ahead and create that. Publish the branch as well. And now we see it in the browser, another tab open in that VS Code window. We have this shows us the pull request, which is, I think, really, really nifty. So I'm going to go back here, and now he said, okay, we have the tooling installed. So what does that mean, right? So if I wanted to say this is a, let's see, this is a test. Let's choose test ABC, right? So not a correct spelling of a word or anything like that. Right, so we see here test ABC unknown word. So we can, if we were to push this change, and in fact, I'll do that. Push a spelling error. We'll push that, and we'll see here in the NUnit docs, go to our pull requests. All right, now I pushed the spelling error. Or did I push that change? No, I didn't push that change, which would help. I'll go ahead and actually push that change here. We can see in our pull request here, push a spelling error. Those builds are kicking off now. This build should fail. The spell check, right, should fail this time. We'll see it running here in the there we see it failed with unknown word test ABC, and so this process has failed. Okay, so that's what we want to do. Now, say this is a real word. We really want this to be, this is a real word that we intend to use in docs. We can, oh, sorry, first things first, I can run over this and I can say quick fix. It'll suggest other words, which is super nice. Or, since none of these work, if we want to really add it, we can add it to our config, our cspell.json config. So let's see, if I add it to that file, we can see that change show up over here on the left-hand side. I can say, add an ignored word, right? We'll go ahead and sync those changes, and now that build will pass. So similar for Markdown, for example, if we say, in fact, this might be a good Markdown error right here. If I add an additional space, a couple of things you'll notice. One thing is that when I do this, if I hit save, whereas it saves for me, VS Code is actually going to auto format that back. And so that's actually running our Markdown linter in the background and auto fixing the issues that we come across as part of the editor config. And the nice thing is that you have to remember to do any of that. And that's why I really like this experience of Codespaces, because it sort of gives you the quick ability to edit a file, but also you could get a lot of that nice support on like Markdown or things along those lines. So if you're not just doing a typo and you're really adding some documentation or updating it, this can be a very nice way to accomplish that sort of thing. But say, I guess we actually can't even demo creating a Markdown issue because upon save, it fixes it for us. But let's say maybe this will be an ambiguous one that it can't fix. Okay, good. So here, for example, is a Markdown issue that we introduced. We didn't start the article with a heading 1, but it doesn't quite know how to automatically fix it. We can suggest to fix it if we want, but we actually don't have a fix that it knows how to do. However, we can get more information about the issue, and in our case, we can see the first line in a file should be a top-level heading. So if we were to push this change now, our Markdown linter would fail, but for our sake, we'll just need to delete that. It'll check it again. The yellow squiggly goes away. So this is a really nice way of getting to know the NUnit code base or the NUnit docs code base and being able to edit those things. So let's talk a little bit about how we do this. We do this by using a dev container in our code, in our actual repository. There's a directory called dev container. And if you look into that, there are two files. There's a dev container.json file, and there's a Docker file that we use to build. Now, NUnit uses two Docker files, and this is what I want to be clear about. We'll look at both today. There's the docfx action container. We use that to build our documents in our build process. So that's what runs, in our GitHub Actions CI when we're checking all of our things to make sure they can build. We use this docfx actions container, and then we build on that here by saying, okay, in our build process, we also use Node and a couple of tools. So we will inherit, right? We'll sort of build our container from this docfx action container that we also create in a different repository. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to install Node. We're going to install some package managers. We're going to install cspell and the markdown lint CLI. This is going to give us a consistent experience to what the CI is doing right from within our code space. And then we actually can add some aliases as well. So this is how we get the shortcuts of spell check and lint and build and serve. So we actually have the ability to do those things. Oh, and that reminds me, there's a command called serve here, and I haven't demonstrated that, but it's one of my favorite things about GitHub Actions here. Okay, let's go ahead and look at that. And also, something that I don't super love about GitHub Actions is about GitHub Codespaces is when it does this in Firefox, and I haven't figured out how to get rid of that yet. In fact, can I get rid of it now? Let's see. No, I cannot. Something about clipboard access and Firefox. It's not loving it. That is all right. That'll be a little annoying in the background, and we'll deal with it. But let's go ahead to this terminal again. I wanted to demonstrate this serve command. This is actually going to, all you have to do if you are writing files is enter this serve command into the terminal. What it's actually going to do is it's going to build all of the files, and then it's going to serve them. But you might say, serve them where? Right? This is a VS Code terminal, but it's running in a web browser on GitHub somewhere, right? On GitHub Codespaces. So like, how the heck am I even going to get to this? And something that I think is really cool that you'll see down here when it runs is it says your application running on port 8080 is available, and you have the option to open it in a browser. What's happening here while that opens is GitHub is actually creating a port, it's creating an address, and it's running that stuff in its cloud, where you can actually see here that we have it's running here, and I can go to this address and see the preview of the site that's running. And so I think that's awesome because I have the ability here to now like look at this stuff and preview it live without ever having to clone the repository onto my local machine. So personally, I think it's a huge step forward. All right, so we're going to go ahead now and we'll stop that. I think I can. There we go. I'll stop that site there and we'll continue on. So just to explore that a little bit more. So we've got the docfx action here, and then we've got our devcontainer.json. What our devcontainer.json does, we give it a name, we tell it how to build our dev container. In this case, it's this Docker file here that we just looked at. We look at the forwarded ports, and that means that we can host stuff on 8080, which is what we just did, right? docfx served the site on 8080, and GitHub knew how to forward it. And then we have recommended extensions. So we've got the indent rainbow extension, we've got the code spell checker, we've got markdown lint. So that's what's giving you that sort of consistent experience within VS Code. If we ended up needing additional tooling, we could add that here and add the name of that extension, and we would get that support for everyone who opens a GitHub code space. So I really like the way that this is formatted. And essentially, I was going to demo opening it in VS Code as well, but it would be essentially the same experience, which is pretty cool. So you could also clone the code if you wanted to, open it in VS Code, you'd get those recommended extensions, and you could do that. In fact, you know what? I will demonstrate one thing because I think it's important. Let's go ahead and close out of this code space. And I will open our repository. Now this is locally. I'm opening VS Code on my machine here. And so now I'm in VS Code on my local machine, so no longer in the browser. But I can still do some cool things. For example, let me see if I can zoom in on this a little bit. And what I want to show you is this green button down here. Now I'm running Docker on my local machine. And so the cool thing is I can also say I'm not connected to the browser, I'm offline, but I still want to do this kind of stuff. I can still reopen in container. And that's going to, in VS Code on my local machine, build the container the same way that Codespaces built the container. And it's going to start that up for me locally. And that lets me actually go through and have the same experience here locally in my VS Code in the same container that Codespaces uses. So I get that kind of consistency across my experience. And so I'm very excited about that, because it also means that I don't have to accept the VS Code extensions into my VS Code install if I don't want them, right? I can open it in this container and have them there, for example. So it keeps things nice and clean for me and separated, and I like that as a developer for that experience. So in the process of creating that, and then we'll show you it does the exact same thing. I'll run that serve command again, and we'll show it serving on my local instance instead of that GitHub Codespaces. So many ways that you can contribute to the NUnit docs. And one of the reasons we try to do this is to make, we know documentation sites aren't always accessible for folks. And so we wanted to make sure there were a variety of ways to do these things, to check your work, to be able to go through things for the NUnit maintainers, as well as folks who might contribute to the documentation. All right, almost done here. I'll pop back in the window here. And if you're interested in stuff like this, by the way, I try to do this stuff pretty often, and you can find my stuff at seankilleen.com. So feel free to check that out. It's got all the links to the socials and Twitch and YouTube and all of that stuff. So I'm trying to get into more of that in the new year, and this was a quick way to get involved. All right. Almost done. A little slower here, of course, because it's on my local machine and I'm streaming a broadcast at the same time. So we'll be kind to my local at this point. We're also getting very close here. All right, looks like we're about done. Now it's installing, so now it started up that container, and now it is installing VS Code into that container, which, all of this stuff still feels like magic to me every time I get to do it. So I love demoing this. All right, so it's installing the extensions into the container on my local machine that VS Code is now sort of operating inside of. All right. And I think this is now started. So let me go open a terminal window, and I'll do the same thing. I'll run serve. See here, docfx is running. Doing what it needs to do. It's going to build the site here in a second, and then it should serve it on my local. And lastly, after we look at this, we'll look at the docfx action container, which is how all of this is built. And we'll go through and see what that's doing for us. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and pull that up while we wait for this, just because I know that we may have a small delay there. So let's take a look at this. So what is the docfx action container that I keep referring to? Well, actually, it used to do a ton of setup, because until a few days ago, this container had to install mono. It had to do things in a very specific way in order to be able to run docfx, which required the .NET framework, et cetera, to be able to run. Now, docfx recently released, which, again, kudos to this team. They re-released docfx as a .NET global tool that runs cross-platform. And that's still in preview, but it was stable enough that I decided to switch us to it for this container. And so our container used to be a lot more text. It's actually greatly, the text is greatly reduced. But the idea here is that we build a container that anyone can then run that will run docfx for them. So right now, it's actually, this may even be able to go away in the future, because we may be able to just do this right from within GitHub Actions. But for now, we decided to keep the same format. So what we do is we're pulling this container. In fact, let me zoom in a little bit more. We're pulling this container from a standard Microsoft container for the .NET SDK. We're version 6.0. In this case, we went with the LTS version, and we're using Jammy. Now that's the Ubuntu Jammy edition there, the latest LTS, I believe, for Ubuntu. So we have a couple of things just for our setup where we run the version. We have to set an environment path, and this is to make sure that the .NET tools that we install can then be run. And then we install, as a global tool, docfx. We point out some more things just for our own edification around what's running there. And then I have to add one more hack there for a Git patch that was released, and that is to make sure that Git doesn't throw dubious ownership errors when we're doing a build. And lastly, I set an entry point, meaning that when this container runs, the entry point will be docfx. So when we run this container from our GitHub action, we can pass in whatever comes after it, and it will just accept that. But the entry point here is going to be this docfx tool that we just installed above. And that is really, and then we define our action here, which is really not too much. We say docfx action, we say what we're using, how we're building the action, and then just some branding stuff. So there's not really much to it. In our build process, here in our GitHub workflows on the NUnit docs repo, we have a build process YAML. And we have our separate jobs here. We have linting, which pulls out the code and installs Node and then installs Markdown lint and then runs it. We have spell check, which takes a very similar process, pulls the code, installs Node, because these are happening in parallel, and then builds the site. Now, building the site checks out the code, uses our docfx action container, and passes in these arguments, right? So we pass in the path, same as we have in our local here. We pass in the docfx JSON file, and we say we want warnings as errors. And we zip it up afterwards, and we archive the site artifacts. And then we publish things if we're on the main branch when that happens. So point is that we use this. We do use our container there, and we use it also in our GitHub, our Codespaces as well. All right, so coming back to VS Code here on my local machine, we see the same thing that we saw in Codespaces. Your application running on port 8080 is available. I go ahead and open in that browser. Now this is on my local machine. I can again browse to the preview side of things. And so with that, I think that we've got pretty much a coverage of what we're looking to do in NUnit here. And so we took a tour of the edit functionality within GitHub. We took a tour of how we might modify things in our Codespaces. We took a look at how we might edit things inline in GitHub, and we took a look at how we might make use of our dev container both in that browser and in VS Code on our local machines. So as always, if you've got any questions, we love to have your contributions here. So definitely check that out at, github.com/NUnit/docs. I mean, NUnit is one of the, the longest running, maybe the longest running test automation project in the .NET space. And that means it always needs some help and some tender loving care. And so feel free to, join up there. We'd love to have you, whether it's just a quick drive-by PR, improving an article, or adding some of your own knowledge there. If I can help you at any point, as always, feel free to reach out to me. Again, I am Sean Killeen. You can find me at seankilleen.com, which has links to all my socials, and I'd love to hear from you on any of them. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day and happy contributing to open source. Thanks. Bye-bye.